When both you and the narcissist stop contacting one another, the very first thing that occurs on their end is what I call the recalibration phase. It is a process that is subtle, deeply psychological, and something that most people fail to recognize because it takes place in silence, behind the scenes, long before the narcissist ever makes an outward move. When you go quiet, you experience it as a necessary emotional shift, a boundary, or a vital step toward your own healing. However, the narcissist does not interpret your silence in that way at all. Instead, they take your silence as raw data. Your lack of response becomes something that they feel compelled to decode, rather than something they are willing to respect. They begin to evaluate exactly how they lost their grip on the situation, rather than reflecting on how they might have hurt you. Narcissists are incapable of the kind of self-reflection that healthy, empathetic people practice. Instead, they constantly assess the landscape. They wonder if you just got distracted, if you are actively trying to punish them, if someone else has entered the picture, or if you are simply testing their patience. They look for the angle, the hidden motive, and any potential threat to their position. Your silence turns into a complex puzzle that they feel they must solve because the uncertainty completely destabilizes them. During this period of recalibration, they might not reach out to you at all. In fact, their silence is not born from indifference, but rather from cold, calculated strategy. They might spend their time watching your online activity, keeping an eye on your social circles, or observing who is engaging with you. They are gathering information and waiting for your next emotional move. Narcissists firmly believe that the people they once controlled will eventually return to the fold. Therefore, your silence is not interpreted by them as a form of closure. It is interpreted as nothing more than temporary resistance. This is the primary reason why they do not panic the moment you stop speaking. Instead, they hold back, fully assuming that you will be the one to break the silence first, just as you have done in the past. They rely heavily on the psychological patterns they have spent so long cultivating in you. They rely on your guilt, your fear of ongoing conflict, and your desperate hope for harmony. They fully expect you to eventually fold. When you refuse to do so, their process of recalibration becomes much more intense. They start to worry that their influence is actually slipping away. And that is when the threat becomes truly real to them. In their world, silence is never neutral. It is either an opportunity to re-establish their dominance, or it is a grave danger to their fragile ego. The longer you maintain your silence, the more they feel the ground shifting beneath them, because your lack of contact effectively disrupts the entire power dynamic they have depended upon to keep you in place. When both sides fall into this heavy, uncomfortable silence, the emotional experience is remarkably different for you than it is for the narcissist. This stark contrast reveals an uncomfortable truth. While you feel the deep weight of the loss, they feel nothing more than a profound inconvenience. When you decide to stop contacting them, you are often carrying the full, crushing weight of everything that has transpired between you. You are working through the emotional wreckage, the shattered trust, the lingering unanswered questions, and the complete psychological exhaustion that comes from being in such a volatile relationship. You might find yourself feeling intense sadness, a sense of withdrawal, deep confusion, or even waves of guilt. You are grieving more than just the end of a relationship. You are grieving the version of yourself that stood by and tolerated so much pain for so long. Your silence is born from total emotional saturation. You have finally reached a point where your mind and your body simply cannot handle another ounce of chaos. You are fighting to reclaim your personal space, your dignity, and your clarity. That internal struggle is incredibly heavy, and it takes a toll on your sleep, your self-esteem, your memories, and your fundamental sense of identity. Meanwhile, the narcissist does not interpret this silence through the lens of emotional depth. They do not sit alone with their loss in the way that you do. They do not spend their nights reflecting on what went wrong, how deeply they hurt you, or what they might need to change about their own behavior to be a better person. Instead, their very first reaction is rooted entirely in a sense of inconvenience. Your silence disrupts their established routine, not their heart. They have grown accustomed to having easy, constant access to your attention, your emotional reactions, your apologies, your caretaking, and even your arguments. All of that input served to feed their insatiable need for a sense of importance. When you go silent, that steady stream of validation is suddenly shut off. This does not break them in an emotional or spiritual sense. It simply irritates them. They experience the total absence of your supply in the same way that someone experiences suddenly losing access to a service or a product they have always relied upon. It is a disruption, a delay, and a source of deep frustration. They are not thinking about how they lost someone meaningful. They are thinking about why you are not responding to them. Your pain and their inconvenience exist in two entirely separate psychological worlds. You are mourning the relationship, while they are merely assessing the status of their access to you. You are trying to rebuild your life from the ground up, while they are calculating how your silence might negatively impact their ego. You feel the crushing emptiness of the situation, while they feel the annoyance of an interruption. As time continues to pass, this divide becomes even clearer. You slowly begin to realize just how heavy the emotional burden you carried really was. And you see how much of your own spirit you suppressed just to keep the peace. At the same time, they begin to wonder why something that used to work so easily for them is suddenly failing. Your willingness to be emotionally responsive has vanished, and that is not working for them anymore. The imbalance becomes visible to anyone paying attention. Your silence forces you to dive deeper into introspection and healing, while it forces them into a state of heightened annoyance and entitlement. The emotional weight you are carrying is profound, while the discomfort they are experiencing is tied entirely to the loss of your compliance. When both sides go silent, the narcissist does not experience that quiet as a simple pause or a mutual step back from the tension. They experience it as a direct and aggressive challenge to their ego, because silence from someone they once successfully controlled feels like an act of rebellion. The narcissist views every single relationship through a rigid lens of dominance, rather than one of mutual respect or reciprocity. Therefore, when you stop responding to them, when you stop reaching out, and when you stop providing them with the attention they crave, it completely disrupts the psychological hierarchy that they truly believe they established. They interpret your silence as an act of defiance, even if your only intention was to protect your own peace of mind or to regain a shred of emotional clarity. In their mind, silence is never a neutral act. It is an affront. It is resistance. It is clear evidence that their influence over you is slipping away. This is the exact reason why silence affects them so much more deeply than any argument ever could. Arguments actually give them relevance. Being the target of your reactivity gives them a sense of power. Even your anger reinforces their core belief that they still matter in your emotional world. But silence removes them from the center of the stage. That removal directly threatens the fragile, false narrative they rely on to function. Your silence forces them to confront the terrifying possibility that they are not as indispensable, as desirable, or as dominant as they constantly told themselves they were. Narcissists are fundamentally unable to tolerate ambiguity, and your refusal to communicate creates exactly that, a vast space that they are entirely unable to control or decode. Instead of seeing your silence as a healthy boundary, they view it as a calculated provocation. This is the moment when their internal dialogue becomes severely distorted. They might tell themselves that you are being disrespectful, ungrateful, or manipulative for ignoring them. They might interpret your distance as a complex game, assuming that you are trying to trigger a specific reaction from them because they cannot fathom that you would simply move on. Their inflated ego leads them to believe that your silence is just a tactical move, not a sign of your exhaustion or your need for self-protection. Some narcissists will mentally shift into a competitive stance, seeing the silence as a battle of wills that they are determined to win at any cost. Others will frame it as a deep personal betrayal, convincing themselves that you have abandoned them, regardless of the fact that they may have mistreated you for months or even years. They rewrite the entire meaning of your silence to protect their own fragile self-image, rather than taking even a second to try to understand your experience. As this internal psychological tension continues to build, the narcissist's sense of control begins to crumble. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their own deep-seated insecurity back at them. Rather than sitting with that discomfort, they begin creating elaborate narratives that allow them to restore their sense of superiority. They might assume that you will eventually give in because you have always done so before. Or they might start plotting various ways to punish you emotionally for not behaving according to the script they wrote for you. In their world, silence threatens their ego because it suggests something they simply cannot accept: the reality that you may no longer be under their psychological influence. When both sides stop contacting each other, something very different happens internally for the narcissist than what is happening for you. For you, the silence can eventually become a space to breathe, a space to process, and a space to finally understand exactly what you survived. But for the narcissist, your absence creates a kind of psychological vacuum that forces them to confront something they spend their entire lives desperately avoiding: the total loss of control. They do not think in terms of mutual distance or the necessity of healthy boundaries. They think only of the vacuum you left behind. Instead of reflecting on their actions, they interpret your disengagement as a fundamental fracture in the system they built to sustain their own identity. Narcissists do not operate from an internal sense of genuine worth. Their self-esteem is entirely constructed from the outside, held together by the constant reactions, attention, and validation of the people within their orbit. You were a significant part of that system. Your emotions, your direct responses, and the established pattern of you returning after every conflict served to reinforce their deep-seated sense of superiority and influence. When you finally go silent, you effectively interrupt that cycle. That interruption forces them into a moment of extreme psychological exposure. It confronts them with the reality of their dependence on your engagement, which is something they do not want to acknowledge even to themselves. They spent so much time building a narrative where they were the dominant one, the person in control, and the one calling all the shots. Your silence directly challenges that story. It acts as a clear signal that you have stepped out of the role they assigned to you. This destabilizes their carefully managed identity. Without your constant reactions, they have nothing to push against, nothing to manipulate, and nothing to use as evidence of their own power. This absence becomes a major threat to them, not because they care about the relationship in a meaningful or emotionally mature way, but because it disrupts the very foundation of control that allowed them to feel significant. This is the specific moment when their internal state becomes restless. They might begin replaying past conversations over and over, searching for clues or signs that they missed. They may start to wonder if someone else has successfully taken their place. They may begin scanning for ways to reassert their dominance, even if they still have not reached out to you directly. The silence becomes much louder for them than it ever does for you, because they simply do not know what is happening on your side of the wall. That lack of visibility robs them of the comforting illusion that they can predict your behavior. They are suddenly pushed outside of your world rather than being at the very center of it. For them, that loss of centrality is psychologically intolerable. Their mindset shifts from arrogance to anxiety, from entitlement to suspicion, and from total certainty to deep instability. All of it is triggered by something as simple as your absence. When both you and the narcissist retreat into silence, it may seem from the outside like nothing is happening at all. But internally, the narcissist begins moving through a very predictable series of compensatory behaviors designed to restore their sense of control. One of the most common reactions is their desperate attempt to fill the void your absence created through tactics like hoovering, baiting, or triangulation. These tactics are never random. They are calculated psychological tools that the narcissist employs the moment they feel their influence over you slipping. Hoovering happens when they finally realize your silence is not just a temporary phase. At first, they assume you will return because that is what they have conditioned you to do for so long. When you do not return, the panic truly starts to set in. Hoovering is their direct attempt to pull you back into the cycle, not because they value you emotionally, but because losing you threatens their internal ego stability. They might send a soft, gentle message, bring up a nostalgic memory, or offer a crisis-centered plea for your attention. They might appear deeply remorseful, reflective, or unusually attentive to your needs. They adjust their tone to whatever they believe will work best, because the goal is not genuine reconnection. It is strictly about reinstating their control over you. If hoovering fails or feels too vulnerable for them to attempt, they will shift to baiting. Baiting is specifically designed to provoke an emotional reaction from you, whether that reaction is positive or negative. The narcissist does not care which direction your emotions go. What they care about is being the cause of those emotions. They might post something on social media specifically aimed at triggering your jealousy, send a sharp or dismissive message just to get you angry, or create some unnecessary drama that forces you to provide them with a response. Any reaction, even one rooted in anger or frustration, restores their sense of relevance. Silence strips them of their power, so baiting becomes their primary way of poking the wound they created, hoping that you will bleed just enough to remind them that you are still accessible. When those strategies fail to work, they will likely escalate to triangulation. This is where they bring in a third party, such as an ex-partner, a new interest, a friend, or a family member. They do not do this for any type of genuine connection, but rather to craft a new narrative that puts them back in control. They might flaunt a new relationship, hint that someone else appreciates them much more than you did, or exaggerate the circumstances of your silence to make themselves appear like the victim.